Let me know. Oh, okay. Welcome everybody to this meeting of Soteria, where we have for the second time Dr. Heward Wilkinson, so probably known to most of you. He is a fellow of the United Kingdom Council for Psychotherapy and has written a lot of papers on the subject of psychotherapy and in the journal, International Journal of Psychotherapy. He's also vice chairman of the De Vere Society, and his first talk was on the subject of the Shakespeare authorship question. Today, he is speaking on the subject of Platonism in literature, though I think it would be more appropriate if he gave himself a proper description of how he's approaching that difficult subject. The title is Platonism in mainly English literature since the Renaissance. And I just quote, in case people didn't receive my mail, that he wrote, while there are significant specific authors influenced by Platonism, J.C. Powys and EM Forster, to name two British examples, he will be focusing mainly on a more fundamental influence, which is connected with the modern concept of individuation, which my way of thinking, but I'm not a philosopher, would be the contrary of Platonism. In his view, the influence of this individuation is radical, all-pervasive, and historical-ontological. And with those words, I warmly welcome Heward to talk on that subject.
When Michael invited me to pick up this theme, I don't know what lay behind it for him, but it sparked a crystallization for me. And that's what I've been developing since we first mentioned it. And as with the colleague of mine in the De Vere Society suggested that there was a possibility that Jane Austen might know something about the authorship question. And I proceeded to delve into that and found that she knew about it in spades, much to my surprise. Well, I discovered not quite such a definite voluntary conspiracy of hiddenness as I found in Jane Austen, but a kind of inadvertent hiddenness of an emergent Platonism, which seems to me very powerful within both our literary and our philosophical and our historical culture in various ways. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I have to pack in a hell of a lot in about 40, 45 minutes. So I'll be going a bit like the clappers, as they say. But I'm wanting to keep it fairly short so that there's a good substantial time for discussion. And I'm going to start off by a sidelong glance at Jacques Derrida and deconstruction, and that will lead me into J.L. Austin, and J.L. Austin will then lead me into a little sidelong glance at Bertrand Russell and Willard Van Orman Quine and the theory of the bound variable. And that will then lead me on to Peter Strawson and his more spacious views on all of this stuff, which will lead me across to the literary material. So I'm going to start by epitomizing the position of Derrida about conceptualization and language by reading you a poem I'm sure that you will all know. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculpture well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And what Derrida argues in signature event context is that words have to be able to survive the death of their author or speaker. And at the same time, he's drawing out the history of a point of view which he associates with the 18th century writers Robertson and Condillac. And what he says about Condillac is this, because what is clear is that there was very little doubt about the possibility of accurate reference in the 18th century. This is on page 6 of the translation of Derrida's signature event context and later discussions of it, including a summary of John R. Searle's response to it, which was published under the title of Limited Ink. Société Responsabilité Limitée, SARL, but she also plays around with those initials in teasing Searle's in his very naughty way. If I define notions such as those of Condillac as ideological, it is because against the background of a vast, powerful and systematic philosophical tradition dominated by the prominence of the idea, eidos, idea, that's the reference to Plato in the 18th century, they delineate the field of reflection of the French ideologue who in the wake of Condillac, this is the key passage, elaborated a theory of the sign as representation of the idea, which itself represented the object perceived. And there, as it were, you have the foothold of all the anxieties that Russell was struggling with in the early years of the 20th century. From that point on, communication is that which circulates a representation as an ideal content, meaning, and writing is a species of this general communication, a species, a communication admitting a relative specificity within a genre. And what this is going to lead Derrida onto is a discussion of J.L. Austin and the performative, and the discovery of the performative. Derrida not only was highly admiring of, but it remained very significant in his ethical thinking to the end of his life. With all the difficulties encountered by Austin in an analysis which is patient, open, apoetical, in constant transformation, often more fruitful in the acknowledgement of its impasses than in its positions, they do strike me as having a common root. Austin has not taken account of what in the structure of locution already entails the system of predicates I call graphomatic in general, and consequently blurs all the oppositions which follow, oppositions whose pertinence, purity, and rigor Austin has unsuccessfully attempted to establish. And then he quotes famously, and there's a long argument with Searle and others about this very angry dispute. he famously quotes from How to Do Things with Words by Austin the following. Secondly, as utterances, our performances, this is Austin, are also heir to certain other kinds of ill. Notice the hidden allusion to Hamlet's words there in the to be or not to be speech, which infect all utterances. And these likewise, though again they might be brought into a more general account, we are deliberately at present excluding. I mean, for example, the following: a performative utterance will, for example, be in a peculiar way hollow or void if said by an actor on the stage, or if introduced in a poem or spoken in soliloquy. This applies in a similar manner to any and every utterance. And then there's another oblique allusion to Shakespeare. A sea change in special circumstances, that's the Tempest. Language in such circumstances is in special ways, intelligibly, used not seriously, but in many ways parasitic upon its normal use, ways which fall under the doctrine of the etiolations of language. All this we are excluding from consideration. And then the key sentence, a reference to ordinary in this sentence, is radical. Are performative utterances felicitous or not? Incidentally, the use of felicity and felicitousness is also drawn from Hamlet. Absent thee from felicity a while, says Hamlet to Horatio. All this we are excluded from consideration. Our performative utterances, felicitous or not, are to be understood as issued in ordinary circumstances. And what Austin clearly means by ordinary circumstances and the exclusion of fiction is the realm of the actual, the realm of the so-called real, that something actually exists. And he is not quite denying the possibility of references to characters in works and performatives carried out in works of art and literature, but nevertheless, he's marginalizing them. And Derrida thinks that's a very classical move in the nature of these discussions. So Derrida then responds, I would therefore pose the following question. Is this general possibility of failure or failure to refer, etc., necessarily one of a failure or trap into which language may fall or lose itself, as in an abyss situated outside of or in front of itself? What is the status of this parasitism? In other words, does the quality of risk admitted by Austin surround language like a kind of ditch or external place of perdition, which speech could never hope to leave, but which it can escape by remaining at home, by and in itself in the shelter of its essence or telos? Or, on the contrary, is this risk rather its internal and positive condition of possibility, Kantian phrase, of course, is that outside of its inside, the very force and law of its emergence? In this last case, what would be meant by an ordinary, in quotes, ordinary language defined by this exclusion of the very law of language? And clearly what Derrida is doing there is alluding to language as a type which can be transformed in various contexts. So in my view, he and postmodernism with him in the whole issue about the death of the author and the difference between the narrator and the writer, and those kind of things that come up in modern, postmodern literary criticism, they are operating in the realm of Platonism. Now, I have to say, this Platonism is a rather bastard Platonism, which we were just discussing before it started. Jane Findlay says the following. Jane Findlay in Plato, the Written and Unwritten Doctrines, which is the first of his 3 major works on Platonism. I haven't read all of this, by the way. I'm just dipping my toe in Platonism at this point, though I have long been mindful of Whitehead's remark that Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Anyway, Findlay says, the cosmos of Platonism differs as deeply from the cosmos of ordinary thought as the systematic order of some vast card index library differs from the shelf order of the volumes listed in it, or from the inconceivable scattering of the items mentioned in those volumes. It is a world of notional headings, a true conceptual or logical geography, rather than a world of things as they exist or as they happen or as they are put together, the realm of the actual and of actualism, as I would put it. To change from the normal world of cases to the ideal world of characters is, however, a difficult and painful operation, even if the association by similarity which leads to it is as natural and basic as the association by contiguity out of which ordinary world construction develops. And then he has a spiel about how the Anglo-Saxons have difficulty with all of this, whereas those of a Mediterranean origin don't. So that's the voice of authentic, full-blooded Platonism. I'm focusing on Platonism in the sense of types. And that will take me very briefly to Russell. And in the wake of Russell, there's Quine in his book, From a Logical Point of View, the first essay on what there is, which is well worth reading, which you'll be able to find on the internet. But Russell in 1905 was wrestling with the Platonism that he at that time subscribed to from Meinong, and that is also influential with Frege, who is in the background of both the line running from Russell through empiricism, logical empiricism, and on through to analytic philosophy in Britain, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the line running through Husserl via Heidegger to Derrida and postmodernism and the continental philosophers on the other. And there's beginnings of a rapprochement and a bit of conversation between them going on now. So what Quine and Russell want to do is to remove denoting expressions like the present King of France. And because Russell thinks that if you continue to use the present King of France, you are somehow positing in some Platonic realm or another a mythical or ideal present King of France who doesn't actually exist, and therefore your denotation or reference is only meaningful if that item actually does exist, which it doesn't. And so he reduces that by the bound variable, and the colloquial expression of this is, for example, when we say X was the father of Charles II, we not only assert that X had a certain relation to Charles II, but also that nothing else had this relation. Obviously, the logic version of it, and I'm not very experienced in that, is more complicated than that. But there are two phrases there which together, but neither of them separately, make the reference. Now, I'm going to try and touch later on T.S. Eliot's notion of dissociation of sensibility and the metaphysical poets. Well, I have to say that the tortuosity of that logical move reminds me of the metaphysical poets, because when we actually put together X had a certain relation to Charles II and nothing else had this relation, locked into that double statement is a reference. So we've already brought into view, but more invisibly, the denotation which Russell is trying to exclude. We're playing with language. In other words, he's still gripped by some sort of notion of the magical character of language, which actually conjures things into existence. Right, so I'll leave Russell and Quine, and the slogan to be is to be the value of a variable, and I will just touch on what Strawson has to say about this. This is in his original paper in response to Russell on referring, which I think is 1950. Some youthful bravado is in the style of this paper. This points the way to a correct answer to the puzzle to which the theory of descriptions gives a fatally incorrect answer. The important point is that the question of whether the sentence is significant or not is quite independent of the question that can be raised about a particular use of it, viz. The question whether it is a genuine or a spurious use, whether it is being used to talk about something or in make-believe, or as an example in philosophy. And those three possibilities, which Austin doesn't properly take account of, because he doesn't consider that what he's doing also violates his own rules, Strawson is much more comfortable and at home with. And in fact, famously, of course, a lot of the arguments about this arose from Anselm's ontological argument, which some of you will know about. And that is the accusation against Anselm and Descartes, is that they thought that existence was a predicate, and that's a very naughty thing to do. Because Anselm says, and I'm now leading my way to the work of art, it is one thing for an object to be in the understanding and another to understand that the object exists. When a painter first conceives of what he will afterwards perform, he has it in his understanding, but he has not yet understood it to be, because he has not yet performed it. But after he has made the painting, he both has it in his understanding and he understands that it exists because he has made it. And I'll indulge myself by reading on here for your delight. Hence, even the fool is convinced, the fool who's said in his heart that there is no God, that something exists in the understanding, at least, than which nothing greater can be conceived. That's Anselm's formula for the being of God. Whatever is understood exists in the understanding, and assuredly that than which no greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. We're going to the full involutions of the ontological argument and the appeal to necessary existence, but that is medieval Platonism speaking there. So the argument is bookended at one end by that, and I'll now come to where Strawson goes in his much more comfortable way, which isn't as bogged down with the dangerousness of linguistic forms as Russell's and Quine. And this is the situation in a paper which is in Freedom and Resentment about whether it might be it. Consider the following example. I enter a room in which a discussion is going on. I hear what sounds like ordinary personal names being freely used and person predicates used in connection with them. I quickly come to the conclusion that the discussion is primarily about fictional characters. I hear the names Anna and Pierre and Emma and Julien Sorel and recognize the characteristics and incidents alluded to as belonging to the appropriate stories. Also, their speakers occasionally refer to themselves. One says she wouldn't have done what, say, Pierre did in his place. However, a lot of other names occur which I can't, it seems to me, place in their appropriate stories. Tolstoy's Anna is being compared with an Anne and Tolstoy's Pierre with a Peter, whom I can't identify. At this point, I intervene and say, I know who Anna and Pierre, Emma and Julien are, but what stories do those other characters come in? And to this, I receive the unexpected reply, they don't come in any stories. Most of the characters we are talking about actually exist. And another example, a child asks to look at a book, usually the classical dictionary, I hand it to him saying, a good proportion of the characters listed are mythical, of course, but most of them existed, or conversely. And that leads on to the next paper in that volume, which is the aesthetic appraisal and the work of art. And here, Strawson goes full out that the appraisal of works of art rests upon recognizing their uniqueness, and their uniqueness, in my sense, is the uniqueness that they have as a Platonic idea or type. So this is what Strawson says. It seems a clear tautology that there could not be two different works of art which were indistinguishable in all the respects relevant to their aesthetic appraisal. By respect relevant to an aesthetic appraisal, I must emphasize, I do not mean anything which has an evaluative name, but I do mean something on account of which evaluative names are applied. But there could very well be two different type arguments, type motor cars, type sentences which resemble one another in all respects relevant respectively to their logical, mechanical, or grammatical appraisal. To use a fashionable phrase, the criterion of identity of a work of art is the totality of features which are relevant to its aesthetic appraisal. So the work of art has not merely the qualitative uniqueness which any type logically possesses, it has a further kind of uniqueness when viewed as an object of a certain kind of appraisal, the kind which its name alludes to. Perhaps I could also express the point in this way. The only method of describing a work of art which is both entirely adequate for the purpose of aesthetic appraisal and does not use evaluative language is to say, it goes like this, and then reproduce it. And that, of course, is not a method of describing at all. And that goes with Cleanth Brooks in The Well-Wrought Urn and The Heresy of Paraphrasability, claiming that the total work of art cannot be paraphrased. And that in turn goes with Lewis's concept that the works of art, or the nature of works of art, is to enact their significance. And he actually gives an example, neither he nor Harding, D.W. Harding, from whom he is quoting, seem to recognize how totally Platonic this is, but this is what I'm claiming. He's talking about the four quartets, and he says this: the play, a creative play with the word still is the very opposite of a game. It registers a habit of intense philosophical meditation, emotionally impelled for a purpose that could only be achieved creatively. For me, the word enactment is lurking behind all of this. The purpose of Burnt Norton is achieved by a marvelous interplay of diverse means in the poem as a whole, some of which very much more invite the description of emotional and evocative than the passage I read. I have somewhere given my own brief characterization of the poem, but I will quote rather what D.W. Harding says about it in Experience into Words. Quote, one could say perhaps that the poem takes the place of the ideas of regret and eternity, where in ordinary speech we should have to use these words and hope by conversational trial and error to obviate the grosser misunderstandings. This poem is a newly created concept, equally abstract, but vastly more exact and rich in meaning. It makes no statement. It is no more about anything than love is about anything. It is a linguistic creation, and the creation of a new concept with all the assimilation and communication of experience that involves is perhaps his greatest of linguistic achievements. And there you have what emerged, in my view, in the 20th century, the hidden Platonism of the modern theory of enactment and of the indeterminacy of meanings in the creation of works of art. And the history of that, which I will very, very briefly go through and then come to an end, is that in Shakespeare and in John Donne and Andrew Marvell in particular, we have an extraordinary self-consciousness and capacity for the creation of individuals, which Harold Bloom called Shakespeare's invention of the human. We think of people like Berowne, Hamlet himself, Ulysses, the soliloquies of Richard II and of Henry IV in Henry IV Part 2, and many other characters in Shakespeare. They're extraordinary, introspective and highly individuated characters. Now, in the background of that, if I can find it, we have Samuel Johnson, who basically says that the characters in Shakespeare are types. And in the process of that, he has embraced the whole model of representation that Condillac, as quoted by Derrida, was evoking, and as a bonus, you get a complete thoroughgoing mimetic theory of the understanding of the work of art, and that mimetic theory dominates criticism right up to and including, and there's some in the 20th century as well, A.C. Bradley in his work on the criticism of Shakespeare, Shakespearean tragedy. And this is what Johnson says. This is absolutely classic from that kind of terrain. Nothing can please many and please long, but just representations of general nature. Particular manners can be known to few, and therefore few only can judge how nearly they are copied. The irregular combinations of fanciful invention may delight a while, by that novelty of which the common satiety of life sends us all in quest, but the pleasures of sudden wonder are soon exhausted, and the mind can only repose on the stability of truth. Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature, the poet who holds up to his readers a faithful mirror He doesn't include the as twere that Shakespeare himself includes in Hamlet. As twere a mirror, a faithful mirror of manners and of life. His characters are not modified by the customs of particular places, unpracticed by the rest of the world, by the peculiarities of studies or professions, which can operate but upon small numbers, or by the accidents of transient factions or temporary opinions. They are the genuine progeny of common humanity, such as the world will always supply and observation will always find. His persons act and speak by the influence of those general passions and principles by which all minds are agitated and the whole system of life is continued in motion. And then the key sentence, in the writings of all other poets, a character is too often an individual. In those of Shakespeare, it is commonly a species. And of course, as we know, and as Lewis constantly points out, the rebellion against that comes through William Blake in particular in the late part of the 18th century. To generalize is to be an idiot. In minute particulars alone is beauty to be found. I can't remember the precise quotation, but that movement towards individuality, difference, and so on, which is associated with the Romantic period, and which we undoubtedly find in the most concentrated poetry of Coleridge, Blake, Wordsworth, and Keats in particular, and later in the century, uniquely and quite extraordinarily, without a single publication to his name, in the work and writing of Gerard Manley Hopkins, which all passes us on to the opening of the doors again that Eliot gives us with the concept of the dissociation of sensibility, where he connects up the possibility of modern poetic writing with that of the metaphysical poets, in the background of which the Elizabethan dramatists, particularly Shakespeare, are in the background. And the nature of those works is nevertheless, although individual, completely and radically individual, and in this I agree, it does not follow from their being individual that they are not ideal. They are Platonic types. And what was happening in the 19th century was that alongside a criticism which was thoroughgoingly mimetic unless it was art for art's sake, in Oscar Wilde and Pater, there was a major creative impulse. Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, the Brontes, Henry James, Joseph Conrad, onto D.H. Lawrence, what Lewis calls the Great Tradition, but we can certainly include Virginia Woolf and other 20th century writers in that. Their masterpiece of Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, undoubtedly needs to be included in that canon. Then we find that the whole theory of postmodernism, without its being named as such, is based on manipulations of concepts and thinking about the radical indeterminacy of concepts conducted on Platonic lines. And along with the development of the understanding of individuality in literature and indeed in other contexts, it's a life work of Jung to think in terms of individuation, and Freud's work moves away from cerebral cortical science to understanding the processes of psychotherapy in terms of the case story, and his paradigms become literature in the form of Oedipus Tyrannos and Hamlet. those developments are going on in parallel. Of course, there's a long war going on with positivism and empiricism, but at the same time, hidden there's another river flowing, which is the Platonic river, which is organized much more powerfully in the things we have to deal with than I think, as far as I can tell, anyone has yet dreamt. And I'm going to stop there so that we can have a talk about all this.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much for such a rich survey.
At such a breakneck speed.
Yeah, of such a large landscape, really, with so many interesting trees and so forth. Could you, you know, in maybe 2 sentences, or 3, give a very rough sort of map, you know, of the main points, main features of the landscape you've looked at, or the, say, 3 points you think all of us should have taken in from what you've just said. I think a lot of people will, myself included, will have been quite overawed by the number of references and complexity of the material presented.
I'm fundamentally trying to give a historical account of the evolution of consciousness through literature in particular, but alongside of it, philosophy as well, from a position which reaches its culmination in the 18th century, based upon representation, truth, reason, nature, a sense of organization of the world on rational lines. And at the end of the 18th century, and perhaps Boswell's own Life of Johnson is a transitional case because it's the first modern biography, effectively. We have a transformation into a focus on the individual. And what I am arguing, that focus on the individual becomes the paradigm which is more and more indirectly explored in the 19th century and gradually emerges into explicit exploration at the end of the century and in the first half of the 20th century. And that is a movement towards the individual. But what my argument is that is still on a typological basis, and which we even see in the dreadful document of American psychiatry, the DSM, because that's all in terms of types. But we will pass that by. But in terms of literature, the greatness of a work like Emma is because when we consider it a complete work of art, is because it conforms to an interlaced typology, and the nature of the work of art is reproduced endlessly. Now, of course, we know situations where there's more than one version of a work of art. D.H. Lawrence produced them all the time, for example. 3 versions of Lady Chatterley, 2 versions of The Plume Certain, God knows how many of the Sisters and Women in Love, and so on. And we have Beethoven producing 4 versions of an overture to Fidelio, particularly Leonora number 2 and number 3 are very similar to one another. But nevertheless, in each case, we can say we know the type of this. And what happens is not that there is a loss of Platonism, but rather the Platonism implicit in the process of individuation and historical consciousness becomes constantly richer and more elaborate until none of us can encompass it in our own thinking. So I'm saying that because of the confusion between actuality, actualism, and individuality, people assume that if something is quote unquote a particular, as in Strawson's individuals, therefore an entity out there which is actual. I'm suggesting that the fundamental nature of individuality that we're dealing with is more like a template or a type or an archetype or whatever, and that's what we find in Bleak House in Nostromo, in Mrs. Dalloway, and so on. So that far from Platonism being in a process of dying, it's in a process of resurrection.
Wonderful. Yes, thanks very much, Heward. That was very helpful. Do you think it's one of the values of works of art, I suppose, in relation to human beings, the novel in particular, that if it's successful, it allows us to come to a better understanding of types that actually exist and have got some objective validity?
Well, it depends what you mean by objective validity.
Yeah, well, something that is beyond one's own, what one's own power to reject or accept. It's something that actually exists in a transcendent way.
I think that there's a diversity of experience which is portrayed in the greatest art, which is attuned to or does mirror what we experience in our existence. And in fact, one of the insights of postmodernism is that we ourselves are all works of fiction, because we're operating according to typologies that we have received from one source or another. And there's very little that is actually fully original about any of us. But if you like, our individuality consists in the ensemble of all the things we are, rather than it's consisting in some unique template, which, as it were, applies only to us. So there are many variations and possibilities, but the nature of the beast is so complex that the idea that we can reduce it to typologies in the template kind of sense, programs, if you like, AI programs, is very much of a stretch at the present time. It may be possible, and as we well know, there are works of art such as Asimov's work, which explore the possibility of whether robots can acquire a sense of identity and individuality in their own right, having been programmed by human programmers. And whilst that presupposes a level of computer development, which we have now far surpassed about 30 years after Asimov's death, nevertheless, they're very thought-provoking works as such. So I think it might be possible in one way or another that individual identity can emerge from artificial intelligence. But in that case, we would be dealing with it as individuation in the same way that we deal with our own.
Lots of topics there. I'm sure people have got questions or points to raise. Prudence, you look as your face is pregnant with questions.
Well, yes, hidden Platonism in the particularity of the modern age. But you refer to Jung as well, and psychology, of course. I've always been puzzled by the confident way in which psychologists and psychotherapists talk about the psyche, the mind. And Jung, of course, thought what we call the psyche is our experience of what is observed in a third person way by observers outside. So it would be just a subjective experience of something that could be, in theory, objectively explained. But I think most Jungians and others go on beyond that, and they speak as if the psyche, subpersonalities, complexes, whatever, are things in themselves.
Things, yes.
So you have Platonism there.
As you're well aware, in the traditions of philosophy, there's a long argument about whether private sense data are, so to say, parasitic derivatives of the physical world and our experience of the physical world on the one hand, versus those who think that the physical world is a logical construction out of actual and possible sense data, though I have to point out that actual and possible sense data is a Platonic notion, of course.
Indeed. Could we say that perhaps the human mind is a Platonizing mind? Maybe we are primates who create abstract categories by nature.
I think that that's a very profound thought, and as it were, that we platonically self-create. Yes, certainly that well-known Platonist of temporality, George William Friedrich Hegel, would have agreed with you on that one. We do precisely gradually create ourselves through self-reflective processes and differentiation and reintegration and so on and so forth. So for me, it doesn't much matter whether, I think there's danger in over-reification of quote unquote the psyche, conscious experience, private experience, the public world, being in the world, and so on and so forth. All of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking almost more of the structure of the psyche. Do we have an animus, an anima, ego, id, etc., etc., etc.? Those are quasi things. I mean, Quine and his disciples, Davidson and so on, postulated that our languages, which use nouns a tremendous amount, are pushing us towards this abstractification. And you could have other languages might do it differently.
Nietzsche anticipated that, of course. We shall not be rid of God until we are rid of grammar.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes.
And so on.
Yes, yes.
And yes, I think there's a lot in that.
I'm not sure whether we should be rid of grammar or God. They both seem very useful things to me, but sorry, Heward, sorry.
Yes, I'm just trying to make the historical point. I mean, Quine himself, of course, has it both ways. He says, well, as it were, on Tuesdays, I believe in a physical world, and on Wednesdays, I believe in sense data. And we can play the field on that. But I think that the point I wanted to come round to, which takes us into postmodernism, is that all of the Jungian concepts are metaphors.
Yes.
And what we are doing is we're metaphorizing our psyches, or whatever we choose to call them. And I don't know whether you've come across the work of Julian Jaynes, Jaynes, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral.
Oh, yes, yes.
And basically what Jaynes argues is that when we cease to organize our experience on the basis of sustained hallucination of the gods, we had to construct ourselves using metaphors of one kind or another. And that's how it, so for example, Zeus is noos. When Zeus has something in his noos, it just means he's got his eye on it. When noos comes out in Plato and in Aristotle, it now means a broad metaphoric vision of experience, and it's being used profoundly as a metaphor. And when we say, my heart bleeds for you, we're in that same territory. My heart bleeds for Ukraine, or whatever we want to say. This was such a fantastic sunset. I was breathless with wonder. Now, we might mean I was literally breathless, but we also mean that breathless is a metaphor for wonderment. And in that sense, it seems to me that as a fairly skeptical psychotherapist, that pretty well all of psychotherapy is founded on metaphor. But then I also believe that the whole of our communications is founded on
metaphor. But all the extreme biologists would say, well, metaphor, our emotions in fact originate in bodily feelings. Our old cortex experiences astonishment as breathlessness.
Yes,
and somehow we moderns can separate our awareness of that from the physical feeling.
The Kleinians would take the same line, of course.
Yes. And Reich and
so I think there is a meaning of meaning, which is itself meaning, but there's no primary meaning.
No primary meaning of meaning.
There are just transformations of meaning. And transformation, of course, is itself a metaphor, and so we go on.
Yes, yes. Thank you. I will log off for this question.
Oh yeah. Anyone else would like to ask a question or before I sort of ask people? Oh, Michael. Now there are two Michaels here. So I don't know which of you has got.
Michael York's waving his finger. I think it's
Michael.
Pointing at you.
Alf
Oh, you're pointing at me. Oh, I see. No, I didn't have a question. Not really.
I'm sure you will have a comment, Michael. Can't you? You know, come on.
But you're talking to me now.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. This is somewhat out of my field, so I have to express myself more modestly probably than I usually do, and probably in a somewhat dimmer way. Yeah, I had one sort of question or comment, which may seem very foolish. Is there a conflict between individuation and ideals, Platonic ideals, or have I rightly understood that individuation is only the variation of a template, in which case you're arguing here that everything in art is based on a kind of Platonism, even when it's very individualistic? I don't know if that's a very...
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Michael.
Is it? Oh, well, thank you very much. You're very kind. This is a little bit out of my field.
No, I think that that's actually correct, and that's what I'm saying. And I think that is because of the preoccupation of postmodernism, and I would have to say also the analytic tradition, with being anti-metaphysical and anti-ontological, and not wanting to dip their toes in that toxic lake, they haven't realized the extent to which they themselves are monumentally metaphysical and Platonistic. And I think we do live in a Platonic universe. I don't think that there's the kind of conflict that Findlay and maybe Plato himself postulates between the actual and the essential. I think they're monumentally entangled, and the whole nature of modern literature is precisely that they are massively entangled, and we can't think outside of this. That's where Kantianism has got us. Not the time.
Sorry, Heward. Michael, would you agree with that? I mean, or are you someone that would not be willing to assent to the proposition that the world is essentially Platonic?
I would.
No, I was actually talking to the other Michael, but I mean, you can certainly are.
My short answer is yes. So then over to the other one.
Yeah, because I know for you, matter has a sort of primacy.
Yes. So I mean, it was a wonderful talk. It's totally flummoxed me because I mean, you go into everything. And I'm just wondering, how would you understand Aristotle vis-a-vis art being metaphor and the type being, I guess, the reality as opposed to the instant?
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Well, Findlay argues that Aristotle didn't fully understand Plato. Although he gives the best account of the doctrines, Aristotle thinks that they're rather foolish, whereas, of course, Findlay thinks that they're very sensible. Nevertheless, Aristotle works, as does Kant, and indeed as does Wittgenstein, with aporias. He works with puzzles, and he seeks to resolve the question of being by differentiating between the accidental aspects of existence or Dasein and the that which appertains to being as a full complement of identity, so to speak. So ousia, substance, is, I mean, I'm not an expert on Aristotle by any means, but I picked up one or two things along the way. Ousia is an expression of identity as a whole, if you like, the categories of existence, which are, I mean, Strawson calls them persons and things, individuals, in his very Aristotelian work, and they are category differences. Now, I have no objection to that, but I think that Aristotle and Kant, and I would hazard actually Wittgenstein as well, are operating to make category differentiations. And if you're operating to make category differentiations about the nature of existence, Heidegger is also playing this game on a big scale, you're dealing with types. In other words, you're in the Platonic realm. In other words, it's not an either or. That would be my thought.
Prudence, are you going to say something here?
I wasn't volunteering to say something, but I do agree. I remember thinking this about Aristotle years ago, that there he is busily making categories, the categories, and yet he's always contrasted with Plato. In fact, Aristotle, of course, is much more of a forerunner of linguistic philosophy and abstract grammar, for heaven's sake, than Plato ever was.
Yeah.
So yes, I utterly agree. Thank you.
And interestingly enough, of course, Aristotle has a much more favorable view of works of art than Plato has. Although, of course, the Platonic dialogues, so nearly all of them themselves were
wonderful works of art.
What's Aristotle's view of the function of art then?
Catharsis.
Oh, right, yeah.
We are
dramatic art. Yeah, dramatic art. I mean, sculptures aren't necessarily so cathartic, are they? Looking at them,
it's basically therapeutic. We're healed by experiencing vicariously pity and terror, and that releases that enables us to unfreeze the shock that is within us. I mean, he doesn't put it that way, but nevertheless, that in his concept of catharsis, which literally means an enema, as you probably know, it's about releasing emotions so that we will experience what Wordsworth calls recollection in tranquility. I can't remember the exact phrase. So,
It seems a very limited view of the function of art. Most of the things which I value most highly in art, I wouldn't describe as cathartic in their effects. It's something quite different, really. But
well, that begs the question: what is it?
It's a sight of some superior beauty that radiates something that one receives as a blessing, I suppose.
Well, that's thoroughly Platonic, of course.
Yes, it may well be, but it's not seeing art as a catharsis, as some kind of substitute for an enema. I mean that really. Oh, Neil, would you like to ask a question or make a comment? Everyone's got to contribute here, I'm afraid.
Just to thank Heward for that wonderful magic carpet ride.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, it's fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah. Daniel. Any
You're
point,
on mute, Daniel.
Yeah, any point that perhaps you'd like to ask Heward to clarify, or a question you have, or a comment?
At this point, no. I have a very great lack of grounding about philosophy. I have not much knowledge about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. It's very difficult for me to follow.
But a great incentive. I thought Heward's talk is done in such a way that one feels one wants to. I mean, I wouldn't normally think, gosh, I've got to read Strawson. I really wouldn't. Sorry, But Houston's talk sort of says, well, maybe I would. So I think, I don't know. Maybe you felt that too, Daniel. I don't know. I certainly felt that a little, I think.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
Edith. I don't know whether the absence of your image means you've retreated to the kitchen or something, but would you like, you always don't want to say anything, but when you do, it's usually a very good comment. Would you, any question or point you'd like to make?
Well, yes, it's just my personal, bee in my bonnet, which I suppose has arisen through individuation as I understand it, but I don't really understand it. I've only just learned the word, actually. And I didn't understand anything Howard said, really. But what concerns me, and I did see some overlap, is that increasingly we live in a very virtual world. We experience the world virtually.
Yeah, that's very good.
And that's sort of accelerating almost exponentially.
Absolutely.
And I just wonder, because of course I love art, I love music, I love literature, but I wonder if it has the experiencing the real world virtually hasn't gone a little bit too far. And I was struck by something you said about there's a sort of watershed moment at the end of the 17th century, or was it the end of the 18th century? Anyway, when the Age of Enlightenment sort of broke in on Shakespeare and all those people, and we started and we started looking at the world in a very different way, and we've just carried on down that track. And I just sometimes I feel that there's a general feeling amongst ordinary mortals, perhaps, but I do detect it that it's all too vicarious. Whether you're highbrow, you go to the opera, or you're lowbrow, you've got your selfies and your Facebook kind of thing, but all of it. And of course, this is what fascinates me about Michael in Cologne, is that occasionally he used to drag us back to minute observation of the natural world, which seems to have really, I mean, people sort of, I don't know, I can't, it's all, I'm a bit confused, but I feel that it may be it's gone a bit too far with the virtual stuff, with art. Because modern art now, just everybody just looks at it and thinks, well, a lot of people look at it and think, what does that mean? You know, how's that helping me? And modern literature, modern plays, increasingly they don't ring a bell, and people are turning back, you know, to older stuff, even quite lowbrow older stuff, because it has more, I don't know. Anyway, I've got confused now, but anyway, that's all I can say.
I'm for fighting at one level a rearguard action on behalf of, if you like, a canonical conception of art. And it is assumed that postmodernism is opposed to that, and it's a deconstruction of canons. And bye-bye, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you.
Connecting with art there in a real way, taking his girlfriend to a concert.
So in recognizing that however rich, there is a value of a canonical way of thinking about traditions, then whilst that is virtual in the sense that you mean, it's not virtual in the sense that I can go on Facebook and I can see 100 pictures of people's cats, as it were, or the lunch that they had at the restaurant, or whatever it might be, because what's happening through AI is a massive and monumental trivialization of experience, which of course Nietzsche anticipated and didn't like at all, and thought that we all had to become Ubermensch or Uberwench.
That's good. I remember that, Heward. That's very good. Ubermensch.
Ich bin ein Übermensch.
But nevertheless, he was definitely onto something, and a lot of what the 20th century was about, and Leavis was this in spades, was about these fragments I have shored against my ruins, as T.S. Eliot puts it in The Wasteland, that actually everything is falling apart, as Yeats puts it, and that we are getting we're moving more and more into epochs of banality, and that's Hannah Arendt, of course. And I do not know the answer, but what I do know is that whilst simultaneously people are more interested in history than they ever were before, as John Lukács points out in Historical Consciousness, which is a major work I recommend anyone. At the same time, the official arenas of discourse are now discounting history, and indeed have simply forgotten it. People do not have a historical sense anymore. Education, what's been done to education in the West has destroyed historical consciousness on a massive scale, and I don't know how we get around that. But as far as I'm concerned, I would like to put in place as strong bulwarks which people can get hold of. And this seems to me one of them, that actually we recognize that we've got 2,500 years heritage, and we actually use it to explore a virtual kind of experience, to be sure, but one which is not banal, trivial, and about, you know, the size of your teapot or whatever it might be.
I think it would be nice to have that as a clip to sort of introduce the whole concept of Soteria, this group. Do you not think so, Michael? Yeah,
I strongly agree. Yeah. I strongly agree.
Yeah. Mick, good to see you. You probably didn't arrive in time to hear most of the talk. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I missed all of it, mate.
Oh dear.
A demo about trying to close the National Brewing Centre down in Burton-on-Trent. So I've just come back from that demonstration to voice my disapproval of.
Oh, right. You weren't trying to drink it dry or something. No.
No.
Oh, well, good to have you here anyway. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to throw in a small point to what Heward so admirably expressed there. I entirely agree with him. I think it relates a little bit to some of the things I said about at the last Soteria meeting about crime fiction, that you have a genre and you relate to different works of art within that genre. And if you don't have the sensory experience, if you like, the direct experience of the cultural milieu that is appropriate for that genre, for example, if you have no knowledge of Paris or of the French language, then I think that the Maigret stories are too abstract, too distant from one's own experience. So what I'm saying is that I think these works of art refer to points of reference that come from one's sensory experience, and therefore one has an understanding and apprehension and enjoyment of them. And when work of art, or if it can even be called art, is created which intentionally, willfully, or even unintentionally produces experience that nobody has that direct sensuous connection with, then it is necessarily meaningless. And that takes us back, I think, to this Platonic idea that there are these underlying universals, that I would understand it in that way, on which one references oneself. That makes sense, something like that, yeah.
But we've sort of been trained to see universals. We tend to look for the commonalities and things. And I mean, I was wondering about asking you, Heward, if a non-Platonic mind would be the Homeric mind, people who act on impulse, to whom thoughts happen, thoughts occur. They find themselves doing things rather than thinking things out. I mean, this was the Jane's idea, yeah. I think. But he has been criticized, of course. I haven't kept up with that debate, but you don't hear it spoken of very reverently nowadays.
Sorry, who are you talking about? Because
the bicameral mind. Man.
Yes.
Julian Jaynes.
Julian Jaynes, yeah. I'm thinking about what would a non-Platonic mind be like if we're all ineluctably looking for categories and types and so on. The world as described by Homer, Jaynes was proposing, is one that is entirely particular and impulse driven and paleocortical in a sense.
Well, for me, that wouldn't not be Platonic.
Exactly, non-Platonic, yes.
No, it wouldn't not be Platonic.
Oh, all right.
Double negative.
Okay.
Because I haven't got the Platonic assumption that all of this is connected with goodness and excellence and so on. That it seems to me the typologies also include more primal forms of experience and also include experience of evil. And that the kind of Platonic universe is a very subtle kind, but nevertheless a perfectionistic understanding. I don't share that, but that doesn't stop me thinking that we can think in terms of types and various kinds of type ways of thinking about experience and structures and so on. So that's why I said at the outset, it's a bastard Platonism. It wouldn't be seen, what we have today would not be seen by Plato as complying with his understanding of experience because of the monumental ethical drive that there is in his thinking. Whereas what I agree that Homer is paleo. What did you say?
Paleocortical.
Paleocortical.
So
Yes.
non-reflective on the whole.
There's a very lot in that. Whereas, of course, the interesting thing is that reflection has entered when we get to the Odyssey. And,
Right,
Yes,
right.
and indeed, Odysseus is precisely singled out for that characteristic.
Yeah.
exactly.
It was obviously not widespread.
Exactly. And James takes that as being indicative of the major transition that is going on.
Of the breakdown of the bicameral mind.
Yeah.
So,
The emergence of I mean, in Jamesian terms, consciousness, which we're all inhabiting at this moment in time, is a form of hallucination. James doesn't spell that out, but it's implicit in the latter part of his book, because he basically says that the study of science too has bicameral origins, and that therefore we're all grip of some kind of hallucinatory framing of experience. We've just introduced a reflective loop into it. He doesn't nail that down, but I think it's a very natural inference from his work. And whilst I think that there are all sorts of things we can argue about James, nevertheless, I think it sheds a flood of light on certain individuals. Blake, for example. Blake was simultaneously a bicameral person and a modern reflective person. Joan of Arc was a bicameral person, has always interested those who are interested in the bicameral mind, but absolutely a superb military commander as well. And of course, both Nietzsche and Jung were thoroughgoingly bicameral and yet also highly reflective. And so it goes on. I think that the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, Prudence, as they say.
You're not likely to find the purely bicameral person.
No, we're not going to do that, but we will find a lot of transitional people. Arguably, both Jesus and the Buddha were transitional in that sense, because they both had in-depth encounters with a devil figure. And they also created traditions which place a very high value on the visionary process, both of them.
Yes. Yes. Fascinating. Yes.
all right. Let me just bring in, apart from the bicameral thing, which is fascinating, and I know it's been kind of dismissed over the years, but anyhow, I think there's something still to consider there. But ultimately, is not the question or the debate, whichever way you want to phrase it, between whether these universals are pre-existent, or is the universal something that we are creating one way or the other, or developing towards? So this goes back to the Aristotle-Plato divide again, as I see it.
I think we're continuously creating, but there are also templates. I mean, the classic one is language. If Chomsky's even half right, there's a massive genetic component in our possession of language. But that doesn't mean to say I genetically inherited English, or that someone else genetically inherited German or Swahili or whatever it might be, because the capacity to learn a specific language and there are no other languages than specific languages, not even Esperanto is a non-specific language, is part and parcel of that genetic heritage. I don't see an either or.
Or this template of language, I mean, is that a pre-existing universal?
I think I would go with Jung rather than Freud on this. Freud was a full-blooded transmission of experience person. People don't do this very much. He believed in archetypes as much as Jung, but he kept quieter about it. But what Jung says is that there are potentials for archetypal possibilities. And whilst ever there was a huge disagreement at some level between the Jungians and Levi-Strauss, structuralists thinking about these processes, if anything is made clear by mythologique, it is that there's endless variety in the creation of myth. But that doesn't mean to say there are not some features which are fairly prevailing and repeatable, but they're also transformable. I mean, we only have to look at Shakespeare and Wagner to look at the transformation of myth.
Indeed.
So I think it's both. Again, music, think of music.
That's why I was going to bring up music, because you're talking about the specificality of language, and yet is not music something that transcends specific language, and so people can communicate through music, even though they have different language bases?
Well, I think that music is just as specific in the form it takes as language is, but Ian McGilchrist and Suzanne Langer are both of the view that the template for the emergence of language was created by music, and music is much earlier in the species than language. But both of them would, as it were, imply that we have a quasi-Platonic dimension to our existence, but we also have an endless capacity to transform it, which is the historical sense, which is, we simultaneously today live in an epoch where there's more historical transformation going on than ever before, and simultaneously most of us are unaware of it. But historicity is alive and well in the culture. Now, historicity, the capacity for historicity may be inherited, but clearly it's a temporally evolving process, and therefore it's partly empirical or partly factual.
How is history empirical?
Because it's determined by events in part. It's determined by contingencies.
But then it still is, those events are interpreted. As soon as you get into the interpretation, then you don't have the empirical ability to test it. It sounds.
I would absolutely agree with that. There can't be a controlled study of history. Certainly not. But and I absolutely agree with you. I mean, Nietzsche said there are no facts, only interpretations, and that's the territory we're in. But I would say there are facts, and we constantly reinterpret them. The facts too are iterable in Derrida's language, but iterability is a Platonic notion.
All right. Edith.
Edith, you're waving goodbye, are you? Oh,
I wanted to say something.
oh,
Sorry.
great. Oh, lovely. Yeah, please.
No, sorry, I missed a bit, but talking about language, it just popped into my head that the people say that even uneducated people have lost thousands and thousands of words from their vocabulary, which describe the world as it is, mostly animals and plants, and which describe physical things. And we've all lost thousands and thousands of words. I mean, they've made lists of the words we've lost and are no longer used, but you find that 500 years ago, they were in use, and they've been replaced by other words, but they don't describe, you know, things, you know, plants, animals, or things that you touch. So I just thought that I just think it's a great loss, and I don't think you know, I don't think even highbrow art, or I think especially highbrow art, is perpetuating that divorce from the real world that was familiar to everybody, and you could see it in the language, and I'm sure you could find the same with any world language, is that you had thousands of words for, you know, I mean, Arabs have about 100 words for dates and about 200 for camel, you know, all the different types of camel that you can get and the different types of date, and they're all fallen into disuse, and you've now got meeting, conference, individuation, you know. To me, it's not progress. I'm sorry.
Well,
So
Yeah, good point. Good point.
my guess is there's actually as powerful a creation of new words, a new slang, a new jargon, and so forth, as there is loss.
yeah.
I agree with you about the losses and what we're talking about. And in many ways, Lewis was one of the most nostalgic thinkers of the century. The wheelwright's shop and all that kind of stuff. The Sturt kind of process, and the appeal to Dickens in particular, as more and more as he grew older, as someone who embodies the old ways of observing and thinking and so on and so forth. But I think he underestimated the degree to which transformation is continuing to go on in language. And I suspect as yet that a major author who doesn't yet exist could actually produce it, could actually give us it. Though in what form it would take, I do not know. I mean, I think I agree with you, there's a massive amount of, let's be blunt, dumbing down of linguistic resources and so on going on. But I don't think it's all that. And I think there are myriad subcultures, some of which are delusional, but a lot of which are actually focused on particular realms of experience, which are actually quite powerful and diverse. And I don't think I think those of us nostalgically inclined are inclined to dismiss all that. But of course, in 30 years' time, we would be looking back at what we have today with some kind of nostalgia, just as now we look back at the 50s.
But I don't think it's just nostalgia, because for instance, my laptop, it's full of little things, you know, if I opened it, it's full of little things. They all have names, but they're not common parlance. All the names, all the things, the tools, the things, they're not sort of common knowledge. They're expert knowledge. But that I am divorced, I don't know what half the stuff's called, you know. So anyway, I don't think it's nostalgia. I think it's actually what we've become divorced from the names of the things that make our world go round. Literally, they don't have names. I mean, they do have names, but we don't know what they are.
I think that's a very important point, that we've lost a lot of the vocabulary of the sensory world and the world of nature.
And tools.
And I think that's an important, and tools as well, Derek.
If you read the Screwfix catalogue, it's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah, well, we rely on the vocabulary of technology and experts who hand down their abbreviations, but it hasn't come from the experience of ourselves, from our everyday lives. I completely agree with that. And yeah, with the experience of nature, it is really, I used to think I was about average, with my knowledge of the names of plants and birds, but I very rapidly discovered, and it's with no pleasure, that I'm a sort of unusually knowledgeable compared to other people, which is a shocking state of affairs, because I should be normal. I should be about average, and I'm not. My cousin admitted to me that he could not identify a single bird except perhaps a blackbird. It is astonishing that we've reached that stage of affairs, and people can't identify trees, they can't identify insects. You know, a fly is just a fly, although there are literally hundreds of thousands of different species of fly. A fly is just a fly. And I think it's getting worse. I would absolutely agree with that aspect of decline.
You're an old-fashioned Englishman, Michael. I mean, because it was a very English thing to know all the trees and all the flowers and everything. But,
yeah, there was that element, wasn't there? The sort of the collectors of the 19th
but
century.
the younger generation, they're not there at all.
I have to be going, folks.
Okay.
Some of us read your comment. Yes, goodbye. Thank you so much. That was very interesting.
I mean, you
very, very much, Heward, indeed. Yes.
You must have put a lot of work into preparing the book. It was so richly referenced. So thanks very much for that. I think we're all appreciative of the care and dedication you've given to the delivering the talk today. So thanks very much. We've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for all of you being so appreciative. I thought I would be probably burnt at the stake, really.
Heward, I'm glad that you've twice encountered very sympathetic and appreciative reactions to your talks.
I hope we're not terribly suggestible, though.
No, anything but that. Thanks, Heward. It was really fascinating talk.
Yes, and thanks for everyone for contributing with such good comments and questions. And we have to obviously bring things to an end, but I think there's enough energy to go on.
Is the recording, Michael? Are you?
Yes, it's being recorded.
Steady is recording it, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and just a short note, in a month's time, we'll be having a Soteria meeting, hopefully on a very different subject, which is Danish literature, Danish writers. But you'll be hearing about
All right, then. Farewell,
Goodbye.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
everyone.
Lovely to see everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.